Welcome to Evil Done Badly's 40th episode. We were the worst podcast in the world 39 episodes ago, and we're still here. And thanks to all three of you for your continued support, and I hope you all stick around. And an extra special thanks to Jeff G for this week's topic. We've got a doozy this week, a real heavy hitter. This week we'll be covering the Butcher of Rostov, Russian serial killer Andrei Chikatilo. There's a lot to unravel here with this guy, so let's just grab ourselves a beverage, hold on to our arses, and let's hear the theme song. This episode of Evil Done Badly is brought to you by Spiffy Cabs, the first autonomous driving service where you're not only allowed to get frisky in the back seat, it's mandatory. Your credit card is no good here. Your disgusting actions will be recorded and sold later on the dark web. We accept payment by the way of your high-definition depravity. There's no need for cash, or clothes for that matter. Pay for your ride by getting it on in the back seat and signing away all your rights in the process. The more risque you get, the longer you can ride. It's a great deal for you, as long as you don't mind perverts on the internet enjoying your nakedness. Bring your libido and hop into a spiffy cab today. And if you haven't already, join up to the wide world of paranormal investigations and ridiculous thrifter groups on Facebook. They've got tons of followers and would love to have you on board. Get in there now, and back to the show. It's smack dab in the middle of World War II era Ukraine, and our little cunt Chikatilo here, he's born on October 16th, 1936, and as you can imagine, it's not all sunshine, rainbows, and ice cream for him and his family. They, like everybody, are dirt poor and are probably eating bugs just to stay alive. Mind you, there's a lot of competition for these bugs and everyone is eating them. So I'd say you're lucky not to get any good bugs, but you're just lucky to eat the shitty bugs. I mean, all the good bugs, they're already eaten. You're not getting any worms here, people. You're stuck with the silverfish at this point. Yes, I'm lumping worms in here with bugs. And if one of you three listeners is an entomologist, please don't get your knickers twisted. Please stick around. We need the listeners. Thank you. I love entomologists. Bugs are awesome. So, he's poor. He's wearing homemade rags, and war is going on all around him. People are being killed, and any second he could be bombed into oblivion. His mom gets sexually assaulted by a German soldier, and he winds up with a sister. So it's not a wholesome environment to grow up in. Now, we all know he turns out to be a crazy person and a murdering cunt, so there's no excuse for that. But I get it, yeah. It's a fucking terrible way to try and raise a family. And it didn't help that his mom was tired of eating cockroaches, and she was a complete bitch and would abuse him physically and emotionally. He wound up sleeping in the same bed as her at times, and he was a bit of a bedwetter. And of course, that was just something else for his mom to slap the shit out of him over. Naturally, he had low self-esteem, and the little bastard had a hard time making friends and was relentlessly bullied. He was awkward and was seen as a bit of a pansy. And to make things worse, when he hit puberty, he found that his dick didn't work right. He got a case of chronic impotence, and this added to his crippling shame and overall resentment of humanity. When he was 17, he managed to pin down an 11-year-old friend of his little sister's and jizz in his homemade potato sack pants. Despite all this crap, he was actually a pretty good student in school. So, despite the home situation, the beatings, the hunger, the torment from his classmates, his marks were half decent and he was known as kind of bright. So, he spent most of his time hiding from the other little fuckers, avoiding having the snot kicked out of him. He's really got nothing going for him. You'd almost feel sorry for him if you didn't know the monster he'd turn out to be. He would go on to be a prolific petty criminal, and he liked taking things that weren't his. He was a little lowlife in the making, but nothing in his early criminal career indicated that he would turn out to be one of the most prolific serial killers in history. He was able, for the most part, to hide his most defining feature. I mean, if everyone knew he had a broken dick, it might have been a bit of a red flag. People with small and or poorly functioning penises tend to be extra angry. I'm speaking from experience here. Note to self, we're gonna edit that out later. No one needs to hear that. And back to Chikatilo. So, the police were probably unaware of how floppy his little wang was. If they'd known this, they could have paid better attention to him. But he did not advertise his erectile dysfunction, so no one was the wiser. Except maybe the young girl who got jizzed on, she might know. But that's irrelevant. Moving along here, all she knows is he's a sicko and a big old perv. So despite the broken penis, he still goes around peeking in windows, hoping to spy something interesting in the way of naked people going on. So he's a little limp dick pervert, and that will play into his nutty rampage later on. In 1955, he would put his limp dick into action with a woman who willingly spent time with him. He could never perform, so she was very understanding, and she dumped his sorry ass after a year or so. I'd say he had a good run for a guy who couldn't get a stiffy. She stuck around surprisingly long. He would later join the Russian army and get thrown in prison for taking more stuff that wasn't his. Sneaky little cunt. Okay, never mind, there's only so sneaky he can be, because he keeps getting caught. This dumb little fucker is not that sneaky. Unfortunately, he'll figure out the sneaky bit a little later, because he will evade capture for many years as he begins his flurry of ultraviolence in the late 70s. After his time in the army, he would move back in with his parents in Rostov and meet a young divorcee. They would hit it off and spend 3 months trying to get little Andrei's wiener working. Well, it still doesn't work. And in the process of being inept with the divorcee, more women in the vicinity find out about his sexual inadequacy, and well, that's not good for his morale, and he becomes suicidal. He tries to hang himself, and unfortunately, the neighbors and his mom yank him down in time to save him. When he recovers from that, he decides he can't stay here, because everyone knows that he's useless in the sack. So he gets the fuck out of town and moves to Rostov and becomes a communications engineer. His sister moves in with him and lives there for about 6 months. But she's not quite as inept as he is. She gets married and she moves out. She sympathizes with Andrei's shyness around women and his loneliness, and pledges to help him find Mrs. Right. She basically arranges a marriage for him, and his wife, Feodosia Adnacheva, would give birth to 2 children. Not because he figured out how to ignite his dick, but because he figured out how to slap his spooge up there with his fingers. Or so they said. That's how they said his children were born, but I got a feeling there was a German soldier involved. That German soldier has a couple of kids. Andrei goes back to school and gets a couple of useless degrees that qualify him to teach Russian literature and manage sporting activities. Nothing can go wrong here. Seems reasonable. This guy should really be kept away from children in shorts. But no one knew that at the time. According to Chikatilo, his students did not respect him and they gave him a hard time. And he's still having a hard time getting hard. And despite that, he gropes a swimming 15-year-old student, and his little floppy bird goes off again, and he blows his load in the pool. He then escalates to beating a girl and attempting to rape her after he locked her in his classroom. And he would diddle himself with the children around. All this? He was never disciplined for any of this. And around this time, he discovered that, hey, chewing gum is a great bribe for earning children's trust. There's no shortage of chewing gum, so that's a bad sign. He was eventually let go from his job due to numerous complaints about his lewdness. He just moved on to, another school. And then he got laid off and moved on to yet another school, where he was let go due to a whole pile of complaints of child molestation against girls and boys. This last school was in Shakhty, a coal mining town north of Rostov. It's here where Chikatilo really takes it up a notch. He goes from kitty diddler to total psychopath. And on December 22nd, 1978, while he was still a teacher, he made the leap to full-blown killer. 9-year-old Yelena Zakhanova was walking home from an ice skating rink and was unfortunate enough to run into this sicko on the way home. He would lure her to an abandoned shed, probably with bubblegum, and attempt to rape her. Of course, he still couldn't get it up, and he decided to strangle her instead. With her incapacitated, he began slashing at her torso, and then he ejaculated into his drawers. So here, we've established that Chikatilo is one of those mega super psychos who needs to murder people in order to orgasm. Technical term being erotophonophilia, or less technical term, lust murderer. Poor Yelena's body was found a few days later, and while there were witnesses that could place Chikatilo with the victim, and blood found near his shed, his wife would cover for him and said that he was with her the whole day of the incident. So, pervy little Chikatilo here is a person of interest, but he is passed over in favor of a younger suspect, 25-year-old Alexander Kravchenko. Kravchenko here has a previous record for the rape of a child, and the Russian authorities beat the crap out of him until he confesses to Yelena's murder. Not only beating the confession out of him, they were prepared to threaten his wife and friends with being accessories to this murder. So they did not want to deal with that, so they sold him on down the river. They were part of his alibi earlier. They were willing to, defend him. But when the heat got turned up, they caved and they threw Alexander right under the bus. So Kravchenko is sentenced to death based on more or less nothing. And later, he has his sentence commuted to 15 years in prison. Well, that's a start. You're going to execute an innocent man here, but now you've commuted it to 15 years in prison. So that's a step in the right direction. So he has 15 years to stew in prison and plot his revenge against the people who had him put away. Ha 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 ha! But nope. It was not to be. The family of poor Yelena is not happy about the 15-year sentence. And they're oblivious to the fact that this guy didn't do it. And they get Kravchenko retried. And he's sentenced to die again. So in July 1983, he was executed by firing squad. This is stupid. I mean, I love it when people who deserve it get executed, but this is a total fuck up here. Not that this Kravchenko dude is any angel, but he shouldn't have been figured for Chikatilo's handiwork. They wanted to put someone away for this crime, but in doing so they let Chikatilo go free, and he went on quite the rampage. Good going, dudes. Way to go, guys. Chikatilo loses his last teaching job, well, due to being a pedophile, and he can't find work in the education field anymore. Well, how about that? He eventually lands a job as a clerk in a factory, and this job requires a nice bit of travel. So he has this excuse to flop around all over the Soviet Union and meet all sorts of exciting young people. Chikatilo seems to have been a little spooked by how close he came to being caught in 1978. So he lays low for about 3 years. And in 1981, Chikatilo would take his second victim, 17-year-old Larissa Kachenko. She was waiting at a bus stop when Chikatilo lured her off into a forest area, stuffed her mouth full of dirt, and strangled and stabbed her to death. And so begins one of the most insane series of murders ever perpetrated. Chikatilo would only get more and more demented as time went on, along with getting his jollies by slicing people to pieces. He had also taken to biting and dismembering their genitals for later consumption. He would mutilate the eyes, because he had some weird inclination that his victim's eyes would be able to identify him, even after they were dead. And you know what? I don't think that's that loopy. I think that's coming. You know how all that filthy stuff on your computer is not really gone even after you deleted it? If the FBI wants to know what you've been enjoying, they'll find it. No matter how many times you delete it from your recycle bin. It's kind of like that. I believe eventually you'll be able to download memories from the recently murdered and use the information to help track down the fuckheads who did it. Really smart people are going to figure that out. Now, it'll probably be long after I'm dead, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. It seems like a neat idea to me. So Chikatilo racks up another 15 or so victims, because he's a prolific little shitfuck. By now, the police are staking out bus terminals and train stations in hope of catching this asshole. And it works. And he gets picked up by the police around a bus station for acting all suspicious and stuff. Yay! Splendid. Let's fry this fucker. But nope. Not gonna happen. They took a blood sample from him. And they compared it to the jizz they found at one of the crime scenes. And with 1983 Russian technology, they were unable to link him to the crime scene because of some strange jizz blood anomaly that he had going on. And this is crazy because later on, it's established that Chikatilo has this unusual non-secretor thing going on where him and his jizz have different blood types. So he was let go because his jizz and his blood didn't match up, which they thought was somebody else's jizz at the time. So really, what can you do? And he was let go. Well, he was let go at least for this. He did wind up serving a 3-month stint in jail around this time for some miscellaneous bullshit. But as far as being a serial killer goes, he was well off the hook. In 1985, public pressure is mounting to track this guy down and execute him. They used up-to-date criminal profiling techniques and came up with the following information. It's a man, aged 40 to 50, and is a necro-sadist. Yep, that narrows it down. They're on to something now. They even resorted to interviewing other serial killers to see if they could shed some light on this guy. Just like that movie with the moths in it. So just as they ramp up their efforts to crack down on this guy, Chikatilo decides to take a sabbatical and lays low for the next 2 years or so. In 1987, Chikatilo picks right up where he left off and starts killing again. Only now he decides to mix it up a bit, and he decides to be prudent not to pick up his victims at bus stops. And he decided, I'm going to add a few more young boys to the mix. Now this change in MO threw the police off the scent briefly, but it was quickly surmised that the same serial killer from before had sprung back into action. His defective penis didn't care what sex the victim was. As long as someone was being killed, he could get off on it. And he would strike again many times over the next 3 years. The police presence would become intense, and undercover officers would be stationed throughout the city. And it didn't take them long before they noticed that Chikatilo had an uncanny ability to be in peculiar places where peculiar things were known to have happened. And on November 6th, 1990, Chikatilo is actually seen leaving a wooded area in formal attire. Not woods wear. Actual, business casual formal shit. So, that looks odd in itself. And he was covered in dirt, and he had some smears on his face. And on this particular night, he's returning from murdering 22-year-old Savita Korostik. But the undercover police officer did not know that at the time. Now, the undercover police officer does stop him, checks his ID, and files a report saying that Chikatilo has been questioned about his whereabouts around this time. Chikatilo made up some horseshit story about hunting for mushrooms or something. I hear they're easier to catch at night. And on November 13th, Svita's body is found in the woods in this area. And since they had already interviewed him, Chikatilo's name pops right to the top of the suspect list. Well, since he was seen skulking around here. So they look into it a bit further, and Chikatilo's employment history gets looked into. And weirdly enough, his travel history corresponds pretty well with a series of murders that have been going on, and it's very fishy. And when researching his work history, the people at the schools where he was working were very forthcoming with information concerning his being let go because of all the diddling. Now, this is pretty incriminating, and they placed Chikatilo under constant surveillance. For the next 6 days, Chikatilo is observed trying to strike up random conversations with lone women or children, mainly around buses and trains. But none of these actually lead to Chikatilo doing anything. He just keeps getting rejected over and over, and he just keeps on going. People keep telling him, no, get the fuck away. I don't know how he does it. My feelings would have been hurt too badly to continue. I would have went home and played Nintendo instead. Then, on November 20th, he was still walking around trying to get little children to go with him to the woods. My God, this guy's fucking relentless. I like to think that if he tried that crap in 2023, the whole world would have him blacklisted and probably drawn and quartered in about 20 minutes. You can't pull that shit now. Either way, they arrest him outside a cafe, and they can hold him for 10 days without charging him with anything. Now that they've got him, the onus is now on the investigators to charge him with something before they have to let him go. And the interrogation begins. And Chikatilo, well, he confesses. He confesses to diddling his students while he was a teacher. Yep, okay. But he remains elusive about any kind of murders. And he complains that this is the second time he's been questioned about him. I mean, the first was back in 1984, when his blood and his semen couldn't decide what kind of blood he had. And he's not very forthcoming, and it's a big inconvenience to him because 6 or 7 years ago, you've already interviewed me. Like, I'm free, let me go. Piss off. But during a strip search, the police find a bite mark on his finger. And it's not his. And he has trouble explaining it away. It looks bad, but he's still not ready to admit to anything. Now, the deadline is closing in. And on November 29th, with only a day or so to go before Chikatilo would have to be released due to lack of evidence, they bring in the criminal profiler who did up his profile back in 1985. Apparently, this guy has written a lot about a 40 to 50-year-old man who's a necrosadist. I don't know how you fill 65 pages with that, but Christ, that's a long document. So he starts reading to him from this document. And, well, Chikatilo's head gets really fat because this guy went through all this trouble to try and describe him. And his ego just explodes. And he cannot contain himself. And within 2 hours, he's gloating about all the people he killed and confessing to murders the police didn't even know about. This profiler guy is awesome. 2 hours in, and Chikatilo is singing like a canary. 8 days of good cop, bad cop couldn't worm it out of him. But this psychiatrist sucks up to him for a few minutes and pretends he's actually interested in how he thinks, and bingo! Got him! The police present him with a series of 38 murders. And Chikatilo admits to 36 of them, denying being involved in the other 2. That's a bit much. 38, that's crazy. 36, yeah, that's fine. But he then goes on to admit to 20 more murders and brings the investigators to burial sites that they had no idea existed. He proved beyond a shadow of doubt that he was a real piece of shit. And he was definitely the one responsible for the killings. He gets charged for 53 of the murders. That's 32 females and 21 males ranging between the ages of 7 and 45. The 45-year-old was an extreme outlier. The vast majority of them were under 20. And the other 3 charges were dropped because the bodies were never found or identified. And there is also one other murder which looks very much like a Chikatilo murder, but he has at times both admitted to it and denied doing it. So he's completely out to lunch, but he might have had something to do with it, and I think he did. So, if you add these in, his total could very well be 57 killings. And if that is the case, he would be tied for the 10th most prolific serial killer of all time. And despite Chikatilo being a lunatic, he was found sane enough to stand trial. He was kept in a cage to protect him from the families of the victims, not to protect anyone from him eating their face, and spent most of the trial babbling, singing, and even slinging around his flimsy manhood right in front of everybody. The judge was convinced the whole shtick was just an act to get him declared loony, and therefore not criminally responsible. The judge did not appreciate Chikatilo's interruptions and kept telling him to calm the fuck down and that, quote, "You're not crazy!" unquote. The defense closed its arguments by saying that only a lunatic would have performed such heinous crimes, and the judge should find him innocent by way of being a complete nutjob. The prosecutors pointed out that Chikatilo was able to control his urges, sometimes for years at a time, and evade capture for many years. He therefore was sane enough to be found guilty and should be executed for it. The judge agreed, sentenced him to die 52 times over, and tacked on an extra 86 years for the diddling. I think 52 death sentences is appropriate. They should kill him, bury him, dig him back up, kill him again, set him on fire, poke him with a stick, and repeat. When Chikatilo heard the sentence, he went off his head and started yelling nonsense. That did not help his case at all. He was dragged off to await his execution, and the judge went further and called the police a bunch of dumbasses for not catching him earlier. And for no good reason whatsoever, Chikatilo was allowed to file an appeal, and it flopped, just like other things. He would put in a final request for clemency in January of 1994. Boris Yeltsin would put down the vodka just long enough to reject Chikatilo's appeal, and then he went back to drinking again. Yeltsin then spent the rest of the afternoon hammered in his underwear. So Chicky here is totally fucked by now, and on Valentine's Day of that year, he was stuck in a soundproof room and shot behind the ear. He was unceremoniously slapped in a hole and forgot about. He was forgot about, except by the other sickos who admired him. He spawned a good number of killer admirers, including one Tamara Samsonova, who we've covered on an earlier episode. This piece of shit was pretty influential amongst Soviet psychopaths. He's dead now, but he had it too easy. He should have been hung from meat hooks by his eyeballs and his useless nutsack, and what a cunt he is. And that'll do it for Andrei Chikatilo, and now it's time for an update. Let's see what's going on this week in true crime news. On September 19th, an employee of an auto parts store named Carl Kempinen in Kansas City got into a scuffle with a 23-year-old shoplifter and strangled him to death for trying to run off with a coat full of pine-scented air fresheners. I really have no idea what he tried to abscond with, but what I do know is that Carl is the most hardcore loss prevention professional I've ever heard of. I'd be the world's worst security guard, and I would do whatever I could to avoid touching any of these lowlifes. I'd help them load their pants with air fresheners, for fuck's sake. I'm not getting killed by some drugged-out junkie just to save someone else's crap. I have no problem admitting my limitations. I'd be useless at it. Turns out, Carl, he's a bit too good at it and is being charged with second-degree murder and probably will be going away for at least 10 years or so. In a related note, Target is closing 9 stores because no matter how many hardcore retail security professionals they hire, too much of their merchandise is walking out the door unpaid for. It's pretty bad when they just said, fuck it, took their ball and went home. You'd think the employees tried to unionize or something. That's pretty desperate. That's a shitload of scumbags taking things that are not theirs. And there you have it. Another flabbergasting episode of the worst true crime podcast ever, Evil Done Badly, is in the books. And if you would like to reach out and suggest future episode topics, we can be reached on Twitter or Instagram at evildonebadly, or by email at evildonebadly@gmail.com. So thanks for listening. My name is Dick, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks again. Bye-bye.